quant is very tangible, right? It's so easy. It's very like neat and tidy, and you can see a number and react to a number, and a number fits on a scale. Like, it's just very accessible. And I think that makes it feel more robust. Like, oh, I've actually distilled all of these findings down to something. But once you have that something, it's kind of flat. Like, how do you move it? How do you, like, why is it that number and not a bigger number?
Hey, I'm Stuart Bolcom, and this is the D2C Voice of the Customer podcast. Join me as I go behind the scenes with top D2C e-commerce operators to understand how they leverage the voice of their customers to drive sustainable growth. We'll be chatting about how they capture thoughts and feedback from customers, who owns the customer journey, what tools they're using, and how they translate what they know about customers into product and marketing that resonates and drives revenue. Whether you want actionable tactics for capturing the voice of your own customers, or just want to see how other top brands are doing things, this is the podcast for you. Chances are you know customer research is a helpful tool to help grow your business. But when it comes to actually doing it effectively, it can feel intimidating and easy to deprioritize. Today, I'm joined by former head of research at CopyHackers Hannah Shamji to chat about the research playbooks D2C brands can use to go beyond the numbers and start capturing the voice of their customers. To really get in at the deep end, I'm going to start with a question that I know you have a lot of experience with. So I know from the work that you do, you're primarily focused on surfacing qualitative customer insights.
Right.
But for a D2C or really any business, they may be much more familiar with quantitative data. So why is qualitative data so important when most teams are focused on quant?
I love this question. It makes me like shake my fists internally. I think like quant is very tangible, right? It's so easy. It's very like neat and tidy, and you can see a number and react to a number, and a number fits on a scale. Like, it's just very accessible. And I think that makes it feel more robust. Like, oh, I've actually distilled all of these findings down to something. But once you have that something, it's kind of flat. Like, how do you move it? How do you, like, why is it that number and not a bigger number? Or why is it so big and we didn't do anything different? So knowing how to move the needle on rates, on percents, on conversions, on sales, you do have to kind of like peel back that curtain and go behind the number layer and look into like what I call it like the messy data, right? The stuff that like might not always fit into a nice little bundle, but will actually help you change the quantitative, change the numbers. So without it's if you don't have the qualitative, you're kind of stuck and guessing and shooting in the dark to figure out like, well, how do I change the quant? You do need both. But yeah, I do think that like the sex appeal is so much bigger with quant for sure.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you call it the messy data. Such a good name for it. I've definitely had people ask me or like, want to sort of try to find a way to put qualitative data on a dashboard, or like, how do we report on this thing that is not, like you say, not sort of defined in the same way that sort of a single number might be. So for somebody who's sort of in that mindset of like, oh, well, it won't fit on the dashboard, or, it's like, is there going to be enough data? Can we actually trust this data if they're on, the same number of data points that we have with sort of our quant data? How do you handle that objection? So how do you talk about positioning the value of qualitative data?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I think it sort of made me, I'm going to go on a tiny little tangent first.
We can go on a tangent.
I love it. The tangent is that I think there is tremendous value in being able to like distill qualitative data into something that closely resembles quantitative. Like, to be able to sort of like shrink it down into something bite-sized. So it is meaningful. So it might be able to not necessarily fit on a dashboard, but be like easy to reference, digestible, useful, actionable. Like, that does require you to take the messy and make it not messy, and more closely kind of something that you can pair with like the numbers and the rates and metrics, KPIs. But I guess I always try to think of it I always try to broach it in two, that like, okay, well, quant is half. So how do we get the other half? How do we understand what levers to push and pull to change sales, to understand sales? And I think the way I find success is like I just start asking questions with a client. So like they might show some data and show some insight. And when I start to ask a bit more about the why and like, well, what did you do to get that? And what's different between, month to month? It sort of like opens out some of those gaps on its own without necessarily having to like point at them, which I think is like probably the easiest and best way that they can kind of see like, oh, okay, actually we don't know. We're sort of unsure about this. We're trying that. And then it becomes sort of a like, okay, well, here's like an actual tried and tested approach to fill in those gaps. Let's, do whatever that strategy is, that qualitative research strategy. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this too, Stuart, because I feel like it ends up being much more of a conversation that you just need to have and kind of help them see the value of both and not kind of, more closely tied to one. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that it's not one or the other, right? That they're both sort of equally important pieces to achieving, ultimately to helping a company improve business metrics, right? Like nobody's advocating for qualitative research for the purpose of just doing research, right?
Right,
like the point is to move the needle on some metrics. So yeah, I totally agree with you that the starting point is always, why is that the case? Do you know why? Right? Like,
right.
Do you have, and often people will have some kind of hypothesis or, some sort of inkling that, this might be a direction or might be at least they'll sort of know what the gaps are. Right. So it sort of gives you a starting point for a deeper dive.
And I think also that like, it is so important to realize like, just because qualitative data gets like a messier rap doesn't mean that it can stand alone. Like, also alone, it's not as helpful. Like, does it actually work? Does it actually move the needle? Is it changing quantitative data? I mean, without that, it's exactly the same case. It's just like qualitative data is like the younger brother that gets like hidden behind,
Right. Yeah, totally. So let's, I guess, to make this a little more concrete, like what does good qualitative research look like? Like for a company, and I know there's sort of a lot of misconceptions or sort of uncertainty about like, how do I actually get started with qualitative research, right? Like maybe I'm pretty used to, most business owners are probably pretty used to quantitative data, whether it's in Google Analytics, whether it's, just their revenue numbers and their sort of sales and costs numbers, but which is sort of very sort of hard numbers. But so what does good qualitative research look like? And what does it not look like?
Good question. I think, so I always start with the methods have to come out of like a plan, out of a strategy, specifically research questions. So at CopyHackers, we'd done some work with a client where they wanted to understand why their numbers were changing so rapidly. In this particular case, sales were going up, which was great, and they wanted to be able to hold on to that and replicate it. And so that introduced a very specific research question, like what is moving the needle? Is it a new customer base that's being attracted? Is it some aspect of the offer? Is there particular messaging that they're responding to? Is it the package that the product comes in? And what that did is help distill what are the areas that we need to isolate and inspect. Like what could those potential triggers be? And once you identify that, then we could start to dig into, well, like, okay, well, how do we evaluate that? Is it a survey? Is it about looking at perhaps some quantitative data? Is it maybe interviews with particular folks who signed up to a list but didn't convert versus those who did become customers? That will really help you kind of drill down so that the data that you're collecting can funnel back to answering those questions, right? Because without that, it's sort of like, I've always found that if you don't have clear expectations up front, it's very easy to sort of miss the target when you do collect the data and have that like disappointment of like, oh, this didn't really answer what we wanted to know. So to avoid that, you want to absolutely have that strategy, have that plan, your research questions, and then your methods. But there are definitely like the go-tos, right? The in-depth interviews. It might be online or it could be like field interviews. I don't know how likely that is with all things Corona. Lead surveys, customer surveys. I typically like to start with surveys just because it's an easier, I think it's more comfortable for if a brand is not as familiar or used to or hasn't done interviews. And then kind of at the last question of the survey, tee it up to have folks like join and do an interview. But those are really the two prongs that I mean, there are other kind of ethnographic methods. You could also mine like discovery calls or sales calls, analyze those for some messaging for languages, for objections as well. But typically you can get like a whole host of that insight from interviews and really kind of fine-tune surveys that help people sort of self-select from those. So, I mean, those are the two that I really, really lean on. And if I get the chance and the client's kind of open, I'll jump through the door with those, which I think is, if you're open to it, a really, really powerful way to start. You can hit a lot of areas, a lot of birds, and get really deep in a way that like a survey might not get or won't get you there, right? Like you can have follow-up questions in a survey, but in an interview, you can kind of explore some of your hypotheses without biasing the interview in a way that you just get a lot richer insight. Does that helpful? I kind of went on like a really...
No, that's great. I want to call out sort of two things that you mentioned there. One that I absolutely love that I would suggest that everybody go do sort of right away, right, is including that last question in your surveys to get opt-in to interviews, right? And I think this is something that we, maybe we'll talk about separately as well, but having a method for continuous recruitment is such a powerful tool because it means whenever you do have questions, whenever something does pop up that you want to be able to ask your customers about, you sort of already have that sort of scheduling mechanism in place. So that's a really great one. And the other thing that you brought up there is sort of time to first insight is pretty important, especially with you're working with clients, but even if you're just doing qualitative research for the first time yourself, right? Not trying to make too big of an investment and waiting weeks or months or whatever to get some data so that you can sort of start to see, right? Like just in that first interview, like I mean, I'm sure you are too. Like we're doing interviews all the time. Yeah, it's very rare, if ever, that I come away from an interview and I'm like, oh, I didn't learn something.
Right.
Right. So just doing the first one is such a big step, and sort of the quicker that you can get on the phone with somebody, the better. But one thing that you mentioned there is that sort of surveys and interviews being the sort of go-to methods. So I do want to dive deeper a little bit on surveys, because you said you typically start with that sort of first. And I know you have a project that you're working on to do some survey teardowns and sort of talk about, what makes up a good survey and sort of what are some things to avoid. So when it comes to surveys, do you have a particular, I'm sure this all goes back to research questions that you sort of mentioned that you start with anyway, but do you have sort of a typical like starting point survey? Like if somebody is running nothing today, what's typically the first survey that you would run?
Good question. So if someone is running absolutely nothing, I would do one of two. So with the goal here of understanding why are folks buying, right? That's going to be your biggest bang for your buck. Get you some messaging and some clarity on like, is your value prop syncing up with people? Should you optimize your copy in any particular way? So you could either pop a survey in front of folks who just sign up to your list. I think I just did a teardown on this too. So when someone just signs up to your list, you can ask them what made you sign up to the list. Of course, like a little more nuanced than that, like what made you sign up for, what made you look for X, what X is perhaps the product or the service. What that'll do is help you get a sense of like who's who. Like who are these folks on the list? What are they looking for? What do they want? And you can use that to really start to match your messaging, understand who your reader base is. Once you have a lot of or a decent amount of open source or free text responses, then you can start to kind of ask something that might be more multiple choice or single choice. But that's a really, really good one to start if you want to get a sense of like who's on your list. Another one that's like maybe less, people might think of this as like an afterthought, but I do think a like cancellation survey is really, really powerful. You're looking there at like what made you decide against this, right? And if it's something that you can fix, if it's something that's like, oh, well, why don't we just make sure we include this information up front and we can eliminate or minimize cancellation or churn. Those are two really powerful ones. And the cancellation one and this initial kind of lead sign up are both pretty short, right? You're looking at like for a cancellation, maybe 1 to 3 questions. And for the opt-in one question, maybe 2, which will get you some pretty good data to start acting on like you said, that kind of time to insight, you can really kind of get something that like, let me just feed this back earlier into the funnel and you're good to go. So those are the two that I would recommend starting with and seeing what you get.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great point that, they don't have to be long surveys, and you can always add that extra, would you be willing to hop on the phone and talk more about this on the back end of those? But there are also points where people are switching, right? So people, either they're switching to you or they're switching from your product or service. And those are typically they've just hit some point, right? Like there's some activation energy that's made them make that sort of decision in either direction, and really tapping into that. I really like how you said you sort of help you match messaging, right? It's not about necessarily writing, quote unquote, better copy. It's about writing copy or positioning or packaging or whatever you're going to change that aligns with what your buyer is thinking and sort of feeling in that moment.
Yeah, really, really increasing that relevance. I love that you kind of encapsulated that in like switching, that kind of jobs to be done, sort of like you're switching behaviors, switching kind of products. And those are really charged moments. So to capture, like, especially right in the midst, I think response rate can be really high if you put these surveys on the back of like an action that they're already taking. So like they just signed up, and as you're thanking them, you ask them, hey, by the way, it minimizes like the need to recall. You're not making the survey like an entirely separate event, which can feel burdensome or like work. And you just kind of capture, like, I love these by the way surveys, like, oh, since you're here real quick, can I just ask you one thing? And you get much more accurate insight because they're not thinking about what they're doing. They're like right in the action in that particular moment.
Yeah, people are pretty bad, and we'll get to that in a second, I'm sure. But people are pretty bad at predicting the future and are pretty bad at recalling the past. So yeah, I totally agree. Anytime that you can meet them in that moment is great. But there's probably people out there who are, anybody listening to this who's running an e-com store or something where there's a critical next step, which is not a survey, right? Like there might be an upsell or a cross-sell or an opt-in to something else on that thank you page. So one sort of trick or like, I guess, tip that I would mention for folks is if you're sending a welcome email, especially if you're sending a welcome email from the CEO or from the founder or somebody like high up with sort of name recognition, just ask the question in that email, right? I would always, like you say, always try to put it on the thank you page first or the confirmation page first. But if you can, like, what's the next touch point that you have? And how can you either just ask for a reply to the email or include the survey there?
Absolutely. It's just also they're really warm, right? They just joined the list. They're looking for that email, and you can really kickstart kind of a conversation there. So yeah, that's an awesome idea.
Yeah, I think that's this sort of idea of conversational research or like, research in conversation is really interesting to me. And I think it's something that we're sort of starting to see more of, as people want to be treated like people and not numbers in a funnel or, bots going through a process. So let's talk a little bit, I guess, about the things to avoid in surveys. And they don't have to be in these two surveys that we just talked about, but sort of generally, like if you're thinking, you got to this point, okay, surveys are a thing that I should be doing. What are some things that you should be not doing when you're thinking about your, designing your surveys?
So a couple that are kind of big no-nos in my head, like do not mix two ideas in one question, even if it is technically a compound question, right? So they do tie together. You want to keep it really, really simple. And if that means two questions, go for two. So one actual question that you're asking per question, really simple language, like exactly what you're saying, conversational. If you wouldn't say it out loud, maybe don't say it in the survey. You don't want people like stumbling over the words. And I think sometimes I'll be really careful too of like bolding or capitalizing a word that is pretty critical to the sentence. So for example, a word like not, like if they skip and don't read the word not, it's going to maybe change the way they answer the question. So really using your formatting there just to make it extremely obvious that they can skim, they can afford to skim. And I think that, that simplicity is key. But also so someone on Twitter just commented, I have a poll on there right now that's like, how do you what's your take on surveys? Are they like fun or annoying? And I mean, it's kind of facetious and also kind of like, if you have to pick one, what would you opt for? And someone on there said that they like surveys, but they just kind of get lost. And I think that when surveys start to get high in like numbers of questions, if we're looking at like over 5, even at 5, if you have a question that starts to compound, or they have to like reference a previous response and remember that in order to answer the next question, you need to really like make it easy for them. If they have to struggle to remember, like, what was the thing that you just asked me about? Your data is not going to be as strong, and their response is, you just introduce some friction there. So really, really keep it simple, keep it conversational. Sometimes to the point of like, you might not say it, you might not actually write it that way, but you would say it that way. I would err on the side of like writing like you talk in those surveys and really leaning on formatting. I'm curious, do you have any tips that you kind of lean on?
Yeah, a couple of the big ones for me typically go to recall. I definitely agree about the like using formatting wherever possible, and writing like you talk. I think is just generally a good thing to do.
Yeah.
Being really careful about asking people to predict the future is always a really big one for me.
Absolutely.
I feel like people do that all the time, and people just aren't good at it. And the problem is that, and like nobody, that's no knock on your customer, like nobody's good at predicting the future.
No, absolutely.
I mean, just think about the number of times that I'm quoting somebody else here, but like, New Year's resolutions, right?
Yeah.
Like everybody sets them, or a lot of people set them. How many are not? Actually, I'm probably quoting you here. I think this is from one of your survey TED.
And I think I stole it from someone else who I think I stole it from Rob Fitz. Author
Great
of
book,
The Mom Test. Great book, yeah. But it's so true. Like recalling, I mean, the level of inaccuracy is just huge. And I think that when you ask a future-focused question, it's so tempting, right? Like it can feel really good because there's some sort of promise that maybe they say something really positive and that thing will come true, right? So it's very validating, but it's just really like wobbly stilts in terms of data. So absolutely, like hypothetical questions just steer clear of those.
Yeah, and I think that this sort of ties to another sort of broad category of bias, right? That if you're asking future focused questions and then you follow it up with a question that is, the thing that you're hoping happens, right? Like if we have this idea for a product and we say, how likely are you to use this thing in the future? Oh, by the way, if we launch this product, would you pay us for it? Like you sort of compound the problem, and especially if you're going to use the survey which ultimately is the goal, right? You're going to use the survey data to inform strategy or some campaign experiment or whatever it might be. You can really get yourself in some sort of places where you had the data to support it, but it just wasn't data that was actually valid and sort of good based on the assumptions that people made.
Yeah, and I think it's so easy to sort of forget how sensitive we are as humans. Like, you know how even in like, you can read a text and like interpret. My husband interprets like when I use the ellipses, like the 3 dots, I don't mean it in a negative way, but he'll think it's like laden with like passive aggression. And the same with like in person. I think we're really, really sensitive, and we read in like little bites all the time with like texting, with Twitter, with posts. So I think that the being really, really careful about how you ask questions and phrasing and like the ordering is really, really important to make sure you're actually getting accurate insight and not just like that feel good hit from the data.
Totally. Yeah. And I think the other big one, which actually you mentioned earlier, when you're sort of, especially when you're just getting started, I think this is the risk, but is to only, if you're going to ask multiple choice questions, to only ask the questions or only put the responses that you want as answers, right? And not include an other option, especially if it's a required question, right? You'll get people who will just, it's not really any of these, but I'll just pick one because I want to go to the next step. I want to be done with this survey. Leaning on open response until you sort of have that subset or that sort of selection group, or at the very least always including an other option, right? And the interesting thing is that you'll often get things that are pretty unexpected in the other, right? It's the same thing with like, even if you have a survey that's full of multiple choice questions, I would definitely recommend adding one at the end that's is there anything else you'd like to tell us? Right?
Oh yeah.
Because, and I mean, people always say like, oh, well, when like people just leave us a one-word answer, but I don't know. I've seen time and time again, people will write essays in a text field, and that's obviously not everyone. You've got to like take it with a grain of salt, right? That there may not be significance across a larger population, but there's often sort of pretty rich insight in if you let people write.
And it's a great catch-all. I think that sometimes the survey will, especially if there's a decent chunk of time between the event and then you asking about the event, the survey needs to sort of act a bit like a prompt. So you want to always start with like really easy questions, right? Like kind of factual reference point. You're not getting them to think. And then over the course of the survey, they might start to remember things that you're not necessarily asking about, but that would be helpful to know or they want to share. And that question can really be then like, it just becomes this bank of insights that you're like, you kind of just got as a bonus. And absolutely gotten some really like long, I mean, I feel bad not completing a survey that I get just because I really appreciate when people complete surveys that I send out. But yeah, people will really, really share if you kind of give them the mic in that last question.
Right. Yeah. And I think that sort of is a general positioning of a survey is that, this is not like if you position it as we're just trying to collect data from you, people are sort of much more closed off with how they answer. But if it's, this is actually to your benefit ultimately, right? Like our goal is to listen to you, and as long as that actually is your goal, which hopefully it is if you're sending surveys, but people do open up a fair amount. So we've talked a good amount about surveys here. I do want to ask you one very specific question, which is maybe a little contentious, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because I know you started off your survey project with this survey type, which is NPS, which is talked about a lot, which is touted a lot as the thing that you have to be doing, the thing that you have to be improving and sort of measuring your performance by when it comes to experience and customer satisfaction. What's your take on NPS as a question? I guess so two-part, which is a bad way to ask a survey question. But two-part, your take on NPS as a metric, as a thing to measure a business by, but also as in the question itself for NPS. Okay,
I like this question. I think the NPS is good because it's the NPS. It's a familiar metric. There are like industry standards. You can measure your NPS against a competitor. You can measure against your past. Like it's good because I think the question's biased, but then if everyone's biased, it's like somehow canceling out maybe. And the familiarity factor isn't small, right? Like it's a huge, I think it's a huge point of reference that if you know about NPS, it means something to you. So it does have that like the recognition and the credibility by way of that. I think the way that the score is calculated, there are the score calculation, the tally, so the actual like out of 100 NPS score. I don't think that it's fully accurate, and there are some kind of embedded errors with it, and I don't remember the specifics off the top of my head, but there are a few articles that you can Google and kind of read about.
Yeah, we'll link those up.
Yeah. And then with the question itself, I mean, I just feel like it's this double whammy of future focused and then like a rating scale that is quantitative. And so you have to scale on a scale of 1 to 10 or 0 to 10. And there's no markers there. I think at least with something like a Likert scale, like a 5-point, strongly disagree all the way to strongly agree. There's some qualitative insight of like, we know that the 5 would be strongly disagree. But here, like a 10 for you might be like an 8 for me. Like maybe I'm just not someone, and I'm not someone who would like just give out a 10. I'm always like, there's always room for improvement. And so I think that while it does try to include that like buffer, I know that they categorize like I think it's like the detractors, anyone who answers 0 to 6, and then 7 to 8 is grouped in one category, and then the 9 to 10 in another. So I think that does help kind of compensate and buffer for the subjective response. But when you're asking like future focused, and then they have to speculate, and then on top of that, the 0 to 10 with no real like qualitative measure. I just feel like it's not a useful data point beyond it being an NPS that folks recognize, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's sort of the way that I think about it as well. I definitely agree with you that it's highly recognizable. There's a lot of value in, if executives or whoever's sort of wanting to run surveys recognizes NPS as the metric that is more broadly accepted, then that's certainly a big point. I do think that the vast majority of its value is in being able to compare either your NPS versus others' NPS, or, and I've seen companies doing this well, is measuring NPS across the buying journey or across the customer journey, and then comparing your own score at each point, right? Because then you can say, oh, well, it's 70 everywhere except this one spot where it's negative 30. Right, like we probably have a problem or a bottleneck at the spot where it's negative 30. Right, that's certainly valuable, right, to know. I do think that, again, just the score by itself, sort of beyond being able to identify drop-offs and peaks, sort of in your trend, is you need to know why, right? Like we talked about this, sort of to bring it all the way back to the beginning, that sort of ultimately it's a quantitative measure, right?
Right.
So knowing why there's a drop off at that point is really the name of the game if you want to move the ball forward.
And I think you had mentioned this when we chatted a couple of weeks back, that it is, and I completely agree, it's like a great warm-up question, right? It's easy, it's not a lot of like brain power, and it's great like survey warm-up to then dive into the why and the more nuance. But yeah, I totally agree that it's great for comparison and like a reference point. But as a standalone data point, it's definitely not my go-to.
Cool. So to sort of go the other direction, so start to wrap things up here. We talked a little bit about if you're not currently running any surveys, what should you do first? But if you don't have you have no qualitative sort of measures or research methods that you're currently using, and let's keep it sort of scoped to a direct consumer e-com brand, what would be the first steps? Like if you had to lay out like a 3-step or a 5-step plan that you can go implement, this week to go get some qualitative data, where would you start? And
this is for a brand that doesn't have anything in place.
Yeah, let's say that they just have, they're only tracking quantitative, like page views, conversions, Google Analytics type data. Okay.
I would have them start with those 2 surveys. So it could be an opt-in, so either on the thank you page or, as you mentioned, like the welcome email, and pop into the cancellation survey. And both of those, I would ask for folks to sign up if they're interested in talking more. And then I would leave them like static. I think those are really, really good kind of placeholder surveys that you would just want to have and be looking at the data pretty regularly. And once you get those interviews coming in and interview requests, like I would start booking right away. And if you can look at your quantitative data and get a sense of like through the journey or through like user flows, are there specific points that you want to optimize? Is it kind of the add to page conversion? Is it on site to sign up? Like what are those conversion points that are lower than you like or that you really want to emphasize or focus on? I would speak to those in the interviews. That's going to be a really good place for you to, rather than kind of getting lost in the which survey at first, just kind of have those static pieces, those static surveys, and then use them to set up these conversations that, like you mentioned, Stuart, you can kind of have like a continuous stream. And then, what you ask about in a survey last month might be different to what you focus on this coming month, but you still have really, really strong inputs to the data that you need. So that's kind of where I would start. Those 2 surveys, opt-in, cancellation, checking your quant data to see where you want to optimize, and then putting that as the focus for your interviews, which if you're getting good influx of customers kind of through, it doesn't take too long, I don't find, to get first interviews on the calendar. And once you do kind of one or two, you'll get some good momentum. You'll kind of feel things out, and it will always give a lot more insight than you were banking for. So yeah, that's kind of where I would start. Is there anything that you would add, Stuart?
No, I definitely agree that having that sort of baseline in place, right? These surveys that you can be running all the time, that are continuously scheduling interviews, that's sort of really the first step. Because from there, like, yes, you can definitely ask more nuanced surveys. You can ask sort of more targeted surveys in specific places, but you can never go wrong with understanding why your customers buy and why they cancel.
Yeah.
Right? If you do nothing else, and you do those two things well, you're definitely going to see some growth and see some improvements.
And I think those are such strong transition points too, that they will absolutely impact, like insights from there will impact the kind of middle part of that buyer journey too. Right. So yeah, totally agree.
Cool. So we really haven't got into interviews at all, but we'll have to save that for another time. That's definitely a whole nother topic by itself. So I'm going to wrap up with one sort of final question. It's a little bit out of left field, but we've talked a lot about, getting more than you're probably bargaining for when it comes to learnings and insights from qualitative research. What's been the most surprising thing that you found in your research? And this from a client, hopefully you can share what it was.
So are you kind of asking the full gamut, like surprising in terms of collecting and the nature of the research, or surprising in terms of kind of full circle of how the interpretation and analysis of the research feeds into?
I think the thing that you maybe went in with, thinking it might be one thing, and it actually turned out to be something completely different.
Okay, let's see. I mean, there's been quite a few. I think that if you keep an kind of open, curious mind, each of the interviews do tend to give an extra layer. So I guess the surprising factor has been for me, and maybe continues to be, is that like, if you just sort of stay with people in an interview in particular, they share a lot more than they even think they were going to share. And sometimes even I think that they were going to share in the beginning, often to the point that like they will have this moment of like, oh, I didn't really think about it like that, or I didn't realize I do that, but yeah, that's kind of what's happening. But it does require you to really dig and like ask the follow-ups and kind of chase your curiosity there, which I think can feel in the beginning like, are you really getting anywhere? Because maybe they give kind of a shorter answer than, and if you don't press, you will kind of just be left with that. So I think the surprising thing is like people really are receptive and willing to go with you if you keep kind of digging. And then that's really where that rich insight comes, where it is that moment of like revelation for both people are like, oh, that's so interesting. And they're like, I know, like I didn't even realize that. So yeah, I think that would be the most surprising thing.
Awesome. Well, this has been really fun. We're definitely going to have you come back to do a part 2 on interviews. But for those who want to find out more and follow your survey project, where should they go? And we'll, of course, link everything up in the show notes as well.
Well, thanks for having me too. This was super, super fun. You can find everything that I'm up to and insights in the surveys project as well, all on Twitter. It's just Hannah_Shamji, and you're going to link to it too, Stuart. I know you just said. But yeah, everything's on Twitter. So any posts I put up, any updates on the survey, any random musings, or like, hey, this thing just happened with a customer interview, all of that will be right there. So come say hi.
Awesome. Can't wait to follow along. Cool. Yeah, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, Stuart.
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of the D2C Voice of the Customer podcast. If you like this conversation, I'd love for you to leave a 5-star rating and maybe even a review wherever you get your podcasts. Or reach out to Hannah on Twitter and tell her how much you liked this interview. If you have any questions about the research playbooks we talked about, you can always reach out to me on Twitter @StuBalcom or send me an email, stuart@discoverysprints.com. Next up, we have the next installment in the Why I Bought This series, this time featuring Away Travel. In this series, I interview the customers of top D2C brands to uncover their buying journey and extract actionable ideas for growth. As always, you can find the complete show notes, more episodes, and our newsletter at notnps.com/pod.